Hello, everybody. Okay, today I will explore with you the twofold and contradictory character of the biographical myths surrounding the life and death of August von Kotzebue. And we will see how the interpretation of his ambiguous and controversial figure changed following the dramatic episode of his death. As is well known, the first aspect of the myth, the legendary image of Kotzebue the Jacobin, was born and bred in Britain. The idea that the German writer could be seen as the advocate of radical and revolutionary political positions was in fact mainly and almost exclusively the result of the British reception of his work. This image provides a striking contrast not only with the reality of Kotzebue's political opinions and with the way they were perceived in his home country, but also with the political myths that surrounded the sensational circumstances of his death. Murdered by the revolutionary student Carlotta Sand, who considered him a supporter of absolutism and a traitor of the German national cause, the writer suddenly became the epitome of the innocent victim of political fanatism for the conservatives of the whole of Europe, and a reactionary deserving his fate in the opinion of the liberals, who in turn sanctified the figure of his murderer. Given the quite ambiguous nature of his political attitude, he was indeed highly suspicious of French politics and in particular of Napoleon, whom he harshly opposed, affecting a fiercely nationalistic stance during his activity as a journalist. Some aspects of the British reception of Kotzebue's plays, and especially the fact that they gave rise to a long and crippling debate about the supposedly Jacobin content, are indeed surprising. Thanks to his sentimental comedies that presented outrageous adulterous wives constantly forgiven for their sins, or young heroes who dared to rebel against the patriarchal impositions of society, Kotzebue's name became for the British public, and I quote Marilyn Butler, synonymous with everything most sinister in the German literature of the period. End of quote. The comment penned by the theatrical correspondent of The Porcupine on September 7, 1801, after attending the performance of one of Kotzebue's plays, provides sufficient evidence of this interpretation. I'm quoting here, "It is the universal aim of German authors of the present day to exhibit the brightest examples of virtue among the lower classes of society, while the higher orders, by their folly and profligacy, are held up to contempt and detestation." End of quote. In fact, it could be argued that Kotzebue's ideological and political position had always been extremely ambiguous, but its potentially subversive implications should never be read as the expressions of a clear political statement. As an alternative to the artistically and morally committed plays of authors like Lessing and Schiller, his priority had always been to represent a wide range of social categories and existential predicaments without consciously aiming at criticizing the fundamental structures of society. It is thus very difficult to blame the subtle ideological ambiguity of some of his theatrical works for the impressive discrepancy existing between the type of criticism Kotzebue's plays received in England and in Germany. The difference between the German and the English cultural context was such that the work of a writer who in his own country was accused of being a shallow money-making playwright rather than a dangerous radical could be considered seditious, terrific, and morally revolting in England. The consequences of this troubled and questionable reputation are still clearly perceivable in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, where Kotzebue's fame as a Jacobin and dangerous playwright haunts the controversial staging of Lover's Vows, famously adapted by the English playwright Elizabeth Inchbald. But the legendary figure of August von Kotzebue as a libertine and revolutionary author, the ghost of Kotzebue the Jacobin that was generated by the controversial reception of his work in England, was bound to fade away with a violent and disruptive episode of his death that saw the birth of a new mythical image and of a new ghost, that of the reactionary martyr. The reactionary martyr who is indivisible from the fascinating figure of his killer. The theology student Khalid Sand was among the founders of one of the oldest German students' corporations, the Deutsche Burschenschaft, later known as Teutonia, which he led until 1817. In October 1817, he joined the Wartburg Fest in Eisenach, where he took part in the famous symbolic ceremony of the burning of all books deemed to be anti-national and reactionary. The fact that one of the books burned on that occasion was August von Kotzebue's Geschichte des Deutschen Reichs officially established the writer as an enemy of the German national cause. Kotzebue's conservative political attitude, strongly arguing against any sort of revolution either in France or in Germany, as well as his activity as political and cultural informer for the Russian Tsar Alexander I, established him as an ideal moral and political target of the German nationalist students. On the morning on 23 March, Zand killed Kotzebue in his own apartment in Mannheim. He had claimed to be carrying letters from Weimar, and once faced with a playwright, he repeatedly ran his knife through his body and then stabbed himself. Kotzebue died in front of his wife and children, while Zand recovered in hospital in the following days. The murder created an unprecedented sensation. As a reaction, the German Confederation passed the so-called Karlsbad Decrees of 1819, which imposed censorship on the press and contained measures against radical students. Sand was eventually sent to the scaffold and beheaded. In the aftermath of the assassination, very little sympathy was shown to the victim, while the murderer became a national hero. On the morning of 20 May 1820, when Khalid Sand was going to the scaffold, crowds were waiting for him on the streets, and after his violent death, many people plunged their handkerchiefs in his blood. His executioner sold his locks as relics, as well as pieces of the wooden platform on which he had been killed. His grave in the Protestant cemetery of Mannheim, where he was buried only a few meters away from his victim, became a place of pilgrimage. In many of the reports published after Kotzebue's death, both in Germany and in England, the student described as a pious and sensitive character becomes the prototype of the good murderer, a tyrannicide following the lead of historical predecessors such as Brutus or Charlotte Corday. For example, an anonymous memoir, a memoir of Charles Louis Zand, including a narrative of the circumstances attending the death of August von Kotzebue, was published in London in 1819, that was presented as the most authentic in Germany, condemns the playwright's treacherous attitude from the beginning, justifying quite directly Sand's homicidal act. Hence it was that the prostitution, I'm quoting here, the prostitution of his pen to the views of kings and ministers, while it secured to him the fruits of patronage and wealth, raised up against him a host of incensed and determined enemies, and in the end sealed his melancholy fate. End of quote. It is certainly undeniable that in the British context, as Geoffrey Cox writes, I quote, conservative writers joined with the German rulers in seeking to portray Kotzebue as an innocent literary man killed by terrorists working for a radical secret organization. End of quote. Ironically enough, newspapers like the Times and the Courier condemned the German students with the same type of anti-Jacobin propaganda that in the past that they had used against August von Kotzebue himself. With the exception of the German Romantic author Frédéric Baron de la Motte-Fouquet, who was probably one of the few contemporary authors who managed to maintain a balanced and objective position, condemning Sand's act despite his not agreeing in the least with Kotzebue's treacherous stance, it is undeniable that the majority of the literary responses around Europe took side with the idealistic young student against the writer who was often depicted as a vile traitor of his fatherland. Literary works like Alexandre Dumas' novel Khalid Sand or Alexander Pushkin's poem The Dagger demonstrated that Sand had become a source of inspiration for many European writers who wrote copiously about the idealized German young patriot. After the publication in France of the novel Khalid Sand, written by Alphonse Brodt, two more famous authors dedicated their interest to the same topic, Alexandre Dumas and Gérard de Nerval. Deeply interested by Kotzebue's murder, they decided to work together on a play based on the event, which was to be called Leo Burkhard, and decided to travel to Germany in order to collect evidence and direct testimonies. After returning from their journey, Dumas wrote about the episode in his story Carl Ludwig Sand, included in the 8-volume collection of the Crimes Célèbres, and also in his Excursion sur les bords du Rhin, an account of his travels in which he reported the whole story once again. In the first of these texts, something between a novel and a chronicle, Dumas' silence on Kotzebue is quite remarkable. After a detailed and moving account of the deep and sensitive personality of Zand, the writer makes it quite clear that history has acquitted him of the charge of murder because it was perpetrated in the name of a noble ideal. Quite different is the treatment of the episode in the play Leo Burkhard, where Nerval, providing us with what is probably the finest piece of writing inspired by the death of Kotzebue, uses it as the mere pretext or the starting point of a text that can be considered a subtle study in the controversial relationship between violence and politics. In this play, the homicidal student, unlike Zand, finally renounces taking his revenge on the alleged traitor and kills himself instead of committing the murder he had planned. Another interesting example of the rewriting of Kotzebue's death is to be found in one of Walter Savage Lander's imaginary conversations, called Zand and Kotzebue, in which the English writer, who was notorious for his controversial advocacy of tyrannicide, imagines a dialogue between murderer and victim, which the reader probably might have expected to be much more revolutionary and radical than it actually is. Lander's representation of his imaginary conversation is focused on the human side of both the characters involved, and the murderer itself seems quite reluctant to act until the very end of the play. You see here an extract from this conversation. To conclude, the myth of the revolutionary student persisted throughout the 19th century, and in the course of the 20th century, several historical novels were dedicated to Zand. Among them, a trilogy of romantic tales by Enrica von Handel-Mazzetti, published between 1924 and 1926, Das Rosenwunder, Die Deutsche Passion, and Das Blutenzeugnis, in which Zand's figure is once again extremely idealized, and the novel Carl Ludwig Sand, published in 1926 by the German author Hans Schönfeld, in which, following the examples of the other writers before him, he focuses on Carl Sand and on his troubled decision to kill Kotzebue. Again, though more than a century has passed, the plot and the characters were structured in order to justify the student's tyrannicide and to stress his idealism. The myths surrounding the German writer are thus centered around two radically different, opposed and mutually incompatible images. The figure of the Jacobin and revolutionary writer, which was a result of the peculiar way in which his work was received in England, and the figure of the victim of revolutionary violence, which was a consequence of the extraordinary circumstances of his death. When Carl Ludwig Sand stabbed August von Kotzebue to death, he gave rise to a new ghost that would haunt the whole of Europe for a long time. For some, Kotzebue was an innocent martyr, for some a traitor who had deserved his fate, but nobody saw him as a revolutionary who had fallen prey to the subversive violence he had supported in the past. Together with the German playwright, it could be said, Sand had killed the ghost that had so long haunted the English stage. The ghost of Kotzebue the Jacobin, of the revolutionary author whose works advocated revolution, undermined moral values, and favoured social unrest. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.